Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman here in the Oklahoman studios. I'm Ben Felder. Joining me is the Political State crew, Justin Wingeter, Chris Castile, Dale Dinwalt, all covering different facets of Oklahoma government. We are less than 2 weeks away from the big runoff election. A lot of races on that ballot, statewide races, including races for the House and Senate. And we're going to talk mostly about the governor today. Chris, you've been writing a lot about the governor's race and this runoff and maybe some of the other elections, and you see some signs out there, and obviously our paper has done a lot of coverage. But I conducted an experiment last night. So it was about 6:30. I flipped on the TV, and Wheel of Fortune was on. And so I don't watch Wheel of Fortune, but I turned it on and I just waited for the commercial break. And what I got during the commercial break was like 6 ads. All of them political ads, some for governor, some for attorney general. Leslie Osborne had an ad on there. So, I mean, for me, who normally consumes my video content through Netflix or on my phone, I don't really see a lot of that, but Wheel of Fortune viewers do, and that tells us a little bit about who these candidates are going after, right? As we have this runoff coming out.
That's right. That for some reason everybody buys that show. I don't know what that demographic is, but that group of
older, I'm guessing.
Older puzzle solvers.
I'm guessing it's older and slightly more conservative, which is kind of what this electorate's going to be.
Yeah, I think on every ad buy I look, Wheel of Fortune. It's all news programs and Wheel of Fortune. So. I'm not surprised. I see them in the morning, mainly when I'm watching the morning news, and they are. I mean, it's just 3 or 4 races, just constant ads.
Well, speaking of ads, we've seen some new developments, especially in the Republican governor's runoff between Mitt Cornett and Kevin Stitt. Catch us up on where we are, because the race went negative last week.
It did. And the race went negative following a couple polls, and from what I understand, some internal polls by the candidates that showed Mitt Cornett pretty far behind. The 2 public polls, one had him down by 10, one had him down by 9, and that's a lot. And so one of the groups that is backing him, the outside groups, the one that reveals its donors, a group called Oklahoma Values, its biggest donor is a local, an Oklahoma City philanthropist and investor named Sue Ann Arnell, who's given $200,000 to it. They started airing ads, I believe statewide, last Friday, attacking Stitt's Gateway Mortgage Group for some regulatory actions taken against it in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis. Stitt campaign, they were ready for it. These are not new charges. In fact, Gary Richardson, the Tulsa attorney who was in the mix for the Republican gubernatorial nomination early, he had done all this opposition research early on about Stitt, and even had set up a website, Shady Kevin Stitt, that had all these regulatory actions from Georgia, Illinois, and Arkansas.
Yeah, showed Stitt like wearing a hoodie, kind of an Eminem-esque.
Crude.
It was really interesting.
But so they picked up on that opposition. I think they just used the same opposition research that Richardson had done, and did this kind of ad laying out these things, not in great detail or with any defense. But yeah, so that started it. Stitt got angry. They had an ad ready. They had an ad. They probably, I don't know for sure, they probably had an ad defending against those charges, but they also had an ad going after Cornett, all ready to go. And
that's interesting because, Stitt criticized the Cornett camp, even though initially, it was a PAC and, the candidate is not supposed to be working. Criticized them for going negative, but then quickly, as you said, they came out with their own negative ad, but that's something that they have in the hopper, right?
It becomes such a inside baseball argument, and an argument that I don't think most people pay attention to or care about was the timing of all this. But it is common for campaigns, big budget campaigns, to have all kinds of ads ready, and clearly the Stitt campaign is going to be ready for this mortgage stuff because Gary Richardson had already used it, and they might have used it against Richardson if Richardson never really had the finances to put that stuff on TV, but they would have had an ad ready. That's what you do. You cut all kinds of spots, to prepare you for different scenarios in a campaign. So they had that spot ready, and I'm not sure exactly if they were going to go negative against Cornett, against this outside group, the Sue Ann Arnell backed group, until Cornett's campaign got, right after it began running. They're like, well, it's not our ad, but it's all true. That's again, this may be kind of inside campaign stuff, but that's a different wrinkle.
Yeah.
You know, because normally when a group runs an outside group runs an ad, you distance yourself from it. You're not supposed to coordinate with them, and you can't. And they didn't. You know, they say coordinate it all with this group, but as soon as you jump on board with it, that's different.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing to say. We just didn't really have. I don't really want to comment on it. You know, that, which is kind of typical. I don't want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I was surprised to hear his.
They jumped on it immediately and said, "Yeah, that's all true." Well, so then Stitt's campaign was okay. So this, whether they finance the ad or not, they're on board with it. So that's when they decided to go with this anti-Cornette ad, and now the latest wrinkle is this week. Responding to the Stitt ad, Cornette has an ad where he says, you know, everything that Stitt is saying is bull Stitt.
Yeah, kind of maybe like we were talking before, maybe a little clever in a marketing meeting, but how well does this play? I mean, if this is truly going to be, you know, Dale and Justin, I'm curious your opinion on this. If this is truly going to be a more conservative electorate, as we expect to be going into a runoff, you know, and there seems to be a battle for voters all over the state, but especially in rural areas that may be very religious. I mean, you know, we can joke at it, but there's some people who may hear, you know, bull Stitt and do a double take and don't necessarily appreciate, insinuating to a curse word like that.
It's catchy. It's a great hashtag. When I saw the ad, I chuckled at the end. But I'm not the demographic that Mick Cornette needs to attract here. Mm-hmm. You know, first of all, I'm not a voter in the Republican primary, but you know, at this point, you know, he's trying to convert people who are older, and since they're voting in the Republican runoff primary, very, very active in Republican politics.
And church going.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure that an evocation of bull droppings is something that is going to drive people to the polls.
Yeah, I mean, and does that kind of show, I mean, do we take that as kind of a level of desperation here at this point? I mean, you mentioned, Chris, that, you know, a lot of these polls are showing Cornette behind. I mean, is this the kind of move that you make when you're, you know, kind of grasping in the final weeks of a campaign that you feel like you're kind of behind on?
I mean, I wasn't in their meetings, but I took it as almost, you know, borderline Hail Mary, because they have to at least understood that it was risky. You know, there is the implied profanity of it is absolutely going to turn a lot of people off. You know, I know Cornette has been around this state for over a year now, meeting Republican voters. You know, he had really no experience with the Republican electorate before this. Very limited experience running for Congress in 2006, where he lost a runoff to Mary Fallin in this area here. But you know, his experience with voting, is that first primary, June 26, you know, where he was the leading vote getter because of this area. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, I just question if he knows really how these people out in these rural areas that he's been meeting, if he understands those people, when, you know, and how they might react to this ad. That was just kind of one of my first impressions of it, is that I don't know how that's going to go over with a lot of the Republican primary voters in rural areas, and I don't mean tiny towns. I mean in a lot of towns, you know, where they just question the judgment of, because these people are not profane people. They're people who would probably question the wisdom of the.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard plenty of farmers curse, but it's one thing being out in the fields, another thing being
though.
Yeah, true. Or being around the living room watching TV, watching Wheel of Fortune.
Yeah.
Although that would make for a great puzzle guess, I think.
B.
Yeah. So, you know, what's interesting to me about Cornette is that when he jumped in the race, there was a lot of interest in his candidacy, because he came across, you know, as kind of the moderate figure. And at a time when, you know, a lot of people are kind of frustrated with partisan politics, and you even saw some Democrats that, you know, expressed support for him. And so it always felt like that the general election, he probably would do pretty well in. I mean, it's, you know, the Republicans have an advantage in that race anyways, but maybe he could appeal, you know, to a lot of moderate and maybe even some Democrat voters. Even the primary, you know, you said, you know, he got the most votes in a crowded field. You know, that kind of made sense, especially this year when you saw such high turnout. Mm-hmm. But was the runoff always just going to be that hurdle too high, going, you know, when you have such a conservative electorate for someone like Cornette?
That was always going to be the question about Cornette, was take away the marijuana voters, you've got a much, I'm not sure what they're modeling for, probably around 300,000 people to vote this time. I think that's what one of the campaigns told me. They're like 500,000. So it's going to be a much smaller electorate, a more conservative electorate, will not be nearly as many young people as turned out, which I think is a demographic that Cornette's pollster told me that's a demographic, that younger voter that they are popular with. So it's a different electorate. It absolutely is, and I think that was reflected in those polls. I don't know. Polls have to, when you go out into the field to survey people, you have to make assumptions about the electorate. How many people 18 to in the demographics, how many people do you include in your survey at various age groups? And they model those based on past runoff electorate. So all you can say is that he was 10 points behind in surveys that probably modeled for past Oklahoma runoffs in which they're older.
Yeah, and that's not just about that you're trying to appeal to these conservative voters in the rural area. Obviously, Oklahoma City, Tulsa are going to be big places as well.
The biggest, yeah.
I think one example of that is I was talking to a candidate who's running. I forget the number. I want to say it's House District 87, but it's this district that includes Deer Creek, so kind of the fast-growing suburbs west of Edmond, and then it also goes south of the Turnpike, kind of northwest of Lake Hefner, a lot older community. And she was saying, that Turnpike really splits it, in terms of the demographics. Still very Republican, but you have your older voters, who are in older homes and condos south of the Turnpike. They're going to show up. They showed up for the primary. They're going to show up for the runoff. North of it, you have a lot of those young families in those new subdivisions who are getting kids to school now, and on a Tuesday you might have a ball game after school and stuff like that, and you don't know that they're necessarily going to show up.
So that's 82, isn't it?
Or 82, that probably is. I think 80-something, I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's the one that had like 12 Republicans in the primary.
So there is a big, for those candidates, they're expecting that kind of shift from, from a primary that saw a lot of excitement, especially in that Deer Creek area, these suburbs, a lot of young families engaged for a lot of reasons. The runoff is on a school day. That has an impact. My son has a baseball game that day, and I was thinking, like, why do they schedule it? Although, I'm sure the runoff election is not big on Little League.
There's early voting.
There is early voting. I'm not saying that people can't vote, but you got to get your kid to school in the morning. Right. You got to get off to work. Then maybe you pick up your kid and you go to the ball field.
It's a good question.
If you're retired, you're there at 7 and you're done.
I think for the runoff and the general is how I see a lot of energy, especially I should say, I see a lot of energy at both, and different, for both parties. The question is going to be if those people turn out.
Yeah.
Those younger people, and I know that district. I know who some of those people you're talking. They are very concerned about education. That is a key, the issue for them. I think it is statewide. Yeah. I really do. And every house, don't you? All the house races that all those people we talked to for the story we did a few weeks ago, it's
almost to a T. Yeah. Every person you ask who's running this year, you ask them, what's the number one issue you see on the doorstep? And they say it's education. If it's not education, it's the budget, which is closely tied to education.
Right. Yeah, and it's education in a different way, because if you talk to a candidate 2 years ago, they'd say education is always important. It's one of those core issues.
Right.
But when you have the walkout, you had some specific pieces of legislation that were constantly in the news, the tax increases. Voters are not just saying, well, I want good schools. They're saying, well, I want teachers to be paid well. I want funding for this aspect of the classroom.
Right.
It seems like voters are, engaged in education in a more specific way that they weren't.
They can say more than just the word education, and say specific things about education.
Yeah, they seem to have educated themselves on education.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to put it. And you saw candidates, even visiting classrooms, going into that turned into a hostile territory a little bit when even students had specific questions about what's your stance on this, and candidates had to take a step back and say, well, I can't just say I'm for education. I got to deliver with some specific plans.
Yeah, that's the thing is that when you get into general, whoever emerges between Cornette and Stitt, Drew Edmondson's waiting with a very specific agenda on how to fund it, how to raise more money for it, and where it should go.
Yeah. Just I'm curious, who do you think Edmondson is sitting there hoping that he draws?
That's a better question for Chris. I would say I was going to point out even congressional candidates hear about education a lot right now, and they've been formulating their own policies and how to fit that within a federal mold there, because obviously it's usually funded primarily by the states, and the education debate in Oklahoma is centered around the states. So even federal candidates, congressional candidates, have had to face that question a lot.
Yeah, well, and you have to answer for those issues too. You know, and a lot of times, in years past, you know, even those who are running for state house, the federal issues have been things that voters have asked. I mean, particularly with an unpopular president for Oklahoma voters in the office. Now it seems like those local issues are now driving, you know, like you just said, Justin, the federal issue, or the federal candidates are now having to talk about local issues. Probably being asked about, you know, during the walkout about the walkout when they really have nothing to do with it, right?
Yeah, but many Democrats running for Congress were at the walkout, and they were at the Capitol, you know, meeting people, just, you know, getting their message out there that way. So it does come up a lot, yeah.
So is this the governor is, you know, the Republican runoff for governor? I mean, that's probably the big ticket item on election night. What other elections are we going to be really interested in on Tuesday?
You can't forget about these 10 Republican legislative runoffs. And if you were to ask me, I thought about this question a little bit.
The ones involve 10 incumbents.
Yeah.
The 10 incumbents.
Yeah.
If you were to, I thought about this a little bit. If you were to ask me which one, you know, should we watch out for, it's not about which one. I think you should look at them all. You should really watch the entire field of these candidates who are fighting for their job against newcomers. A lot of times political newcomers who are coming in trying to be the Republican legislator for their district.
Some of them are a lot of whom are educators, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of education ties there, and you know, once again, you know, you're talking about an election where education is the biggest and most important factor in the way that people vote, and a lot of these candidates were supportive of a teacher pay raise, yet voted against the mechanism for funding it. And when you ask around, people will say, "Yeah, I can see through that." You know, there's a difference between supporting a pay raise and voting against the only plan to pay for it.
Yeah, well, and the reason why this is relevant, I mean, typically an incumbent is a de facto winner.
Sure.
The power of the incumbency is strong everywhere, and has been so in Oklahoma for
very
so long.
high percentage.
But once again, you know, you have to acknowledge the fact that the electorate is going to change a little bit. And you know, I was talking with a candidate who said, you know, that she backed the tax increase, you know, as a Republican. I mean, she wasn't a lawmaker, so she didn't have a vote, but said that she supported it. And now it's kind of distanced herself away from it a little bit in a way that, you know, leads you to think that once again, if you have an electorate that's going to be even more conservative, maybe older, you know, fixed income, maybe wasn't as excited about the tax increases as maybe those young families who are really engaged in schools. So it will be interesting to see if some of those incumbents now have a message that appeals a little bit more to their electorate. But yeah, that's going to be huge to watch. I mean, those numbers. I mean, even just, you know, even two of them losing is huge. One of them is huge, really, when you think about the history of Oklahoma elections. But if we're seeing, you know, 5, 6, 7, I mean, that's a pretty massive indictment on the legislature.
That's right.
Not only is incumbency usually strong, but voting against a tax increase would usually be a pretty safe bet in a Republican runoff. And now you have, as these two have reported, I mean, you have Republican incumbents worried about their increase or their vote against a tax increase and how that may come back to bite them. That's a remarkable shift. There's just no way around it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And having to answer about tax increases when we've talked about before, it's very unlikely we're going to see any more talk of tax increases moving forward, right? I mean, the legislature's appetite, I mean, unless we see some huge wave, you know, of Democrat or really moderate Republicans going to the legislature, which I still don't think that's likely, you know, we're not going to see a new governor unless it's Edmondson, and then maybe that changes things. And he probably would, if he was elected, would feel like he has a mandate for some of his specific policies, which include some tax increases. I mean, if Stitt is your governor, he's not going to go in thinking, all right, my first proposal is another hike on taxes.
That's not.
Yeah.
I think if we see a tax increase, it's going to be either on alcohol or marijuana.
Yeah.
That's the only way that I can see.
Could they do cigarettes again, do you think, since they stopped short? I mean, you had support for $1.50 and they went for $1. Could they do? And how much revenue does that wind up raising? Since it, you know, I assume it has the effect of reducing smoking.
Yeah, and you also have a budget right now that's on the upswing.
Yeah, that's
true.
So
you have the benefit. I mean, I think if you are Stitt or Cornett, I mean, you are loving the situation right now, because if you're Stitt thinking, you know, that if I'm going to be governor next, I don't have to worry about tax increases because we already did it. You know, the appetite's not going to be strong. And then two, the budget is on an upswing where we're going to have a little bit more money for things, and we're not going to go through that that era of cuts, and probably Fallon's probably going out of office thinking, well, I would have enjoyed this economic climate a few years ago.
Right. But she got it a few years ago.
Well, yeah,
her first
true.
term was.
She did, yeah. That's true. That's a great point.
Flush.
But I mean, you're going to be going in. The state coffers are getting a little better. There's talk that there's going to be money for some things. I mean, I don't think they're going to be flush with cash necessarily, but a lot of people aren't predicting those kind of mid-year budget cuts that we've seen in years past, right?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have that problem. And in fact, the most recent figures from the state revenue over the year, they were able to put money into the rainy day fund for the first time in a while, instead of taking money out to pay for state operations, agencies, programs, etc. They're able to put money in because we got more than what was estimated.
Yeah, a rainy day fund that when Fallon came in was, and she always quotes
it's
it,
like
$2.
$2
in there. She hundreds of millions, down to nothing, now back up.
Yeah.
So the rainy day fund has been important in years past. But yeah, whoever's coming in as a new governor is going to have a much better economic climate to be able to come in, and especially if you're one that says we have the money to do things.
Yeah, we'll give them, I think they'll give them the opportunity, and the Republicans are more talking about this than Edmondson is, but to address the structure of government, to address the management of government, which I think, second to education/budget, has been this frustration with how government is run, and the dispersion of authority in the executive branch, to where the health department seems like they're like free agents, rather than somebody a board that actually answers to the executive branch, or just kind of their own. And there are several. Some are in the Constitution, some are statutory. They changed the DHS, right, to make it answerable, and they've changed the health department. Whoever's the next governor will be choosing for the first time the health department director. But there's still this kind of spread out authority where the governor takes a blame or credit for all kinds of things that happen, but has no real authority that he or she can exert over some of these kind of free agent boards, education, corrections, higher ed,
Yeah, there's several other agencies that are kind of on the list. There's a state representative who passed that bill last year, who put DHS under the appointment of the director under the governor, and there are still agencies that he wants to check off that list to be put under instead of the board picking who runs that department, have the governor pick who runs that department.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked about this before. I think it's a system that emerged from this kind of populist group of people that drew up Oklahoma's very lengthy constitution. But with the theory that these people appointed to these boards from communities all over the state, whether it be on transportation, corrections, whatever, are closer to the people. And maybe that was true at the time, but it's certainly not true now, because nobody knows who's on these boards. Nobody could name, most people that aren't could name who's on the health department board or the board of education. It's not closer to the people, and they're not accountable because nobody knows who they are, and
And a lot of these people who are on these boards and stuff, I see them in Oklahoma City a lot. Even those that kind of are representing these other districts, it's like, well, I'm sure they have a house there, but they seem like pretty Oklahoma City people. So you don't necessarily have that kind of local representation as much as you maybe once did as well.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we've got obviously the governor's race, some other statewide races. You talk about those important legislative races where incumbents are trying to hold on to their seat. We've also got some federal races on the ballot, and including here in CD5, a Democratic runoff. Justin, kind of what are the congressional races that you're watching on runoff night?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've talked about it before. The 5th congressional race is the race to watch in terms of November. And so Russell has scooted through the primary without a problem. He's, on to the general. The Democrats have 2 candidates, Tom Guild and Kendra Horn. Horn was by far the largest vote getter in the primary, would be expected to win the runoff, and would expect to go on to face Russell. And she has been able to fundraise in a way that CD5 Democrats have not been able to do in quite a while. She seems well positioned as kind of a moderate Democrat in this district to take on Russell, but we'll see how she does here in a couple weeks.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I keep watching these like U.S. maps like the New York Times does with the congressional districts, and they are color coding like which Republican seats are in play for Democrats, as that'll be a big storyline going into November. There's a couple in Kansas, there's none in Oklahoma, and I keep thinking like, wow, I mean the CD5, maybe that should be, we talked about, is this one that could flip? The difference, I think, here in CD5, while the demographics maybe support the idea that Democrats could be in play, is you've got, Russell, you've got a congressman that's not really controversial. In a lot of these districts, you've got a controversial Republican. The Democrats feel like they have a better chance to get. Russell's not very controversial. He's pretty conservative, but he's kind of moderate at times, especially when he's talking about maybe some of the rhetoric coming out of the White House, although he doesn't command the spotlight a lot on those issues. And then you say Horn has been raising money really well, but she's still kind of an unknown, name. It's not like she's not been a figure, a large figure in Oklahoma politics before. Are any of those things going to change between now and Election Day?
You're right. Russell is more conservative than his district, I would argue, and I've argued on the show before. He is quite conservative for this district. But you're right. On issues like immigration, he's willing to go to a more moderate route, in part because of his own situation. He has children from Hungary, and so that has influenced his immigration style a little bit. But otherwise, he's quite conservative for this district, which is trending blue and should be a more moderate district even than it actually is, because Democrats just haven't come out to vote, or people in those demographics that are traditionally Democratic have not come out to vote the way that evangelicals have come out to vote for Steve Russell. So that's not going to change. You're right. Russell is kind of low key. The flip side of that, if you're looking at it from a Democratic perspective, is that he doesn't have great name recognition. He's not especially well known in this district.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you're right. He's not very controversial either, so he's not going to draw a lot of animosity or praise either way. Horn does have to get the name recognition out there. She does not have much, as you pointed out, but she has the money, and the money will help a great deal, especially in a district which is relatively small by Oklahoma standards.
And she may get national money.
Yeah, we'll see. That would be
despite
huge.
This, New York Times, I think the national Democrats are looking at that as a possibility.
And that'll let us know what the internal polling is showing, and if Democrats nationally think that the CCC thinks she has a shot.
Yeah.
And even if the people in this area don't get energized by that race, I think Democrats, from what I've seen, are energized by the governor's race, and some of these state House and Senate races. If they're not turning out for Kendra Horn, some of them obviously will. They'll be turning out for whoever the nominee is in Senate district to replace David Holt, or 30, whatever that is, or for Drew Edmondson. There will be, I think, a much more active Democratic electorate in this.
Well, I would expect Democrat turnout to be up than we've seen, and that would bode well for CD5. There's a lot of Democrats here as well, and I think that Edmondson, and we've said this before, I think the Edmondson versus Stitt/Cornett race is going to be closer than people think, or at least has been in the past. You have a well-funded, resourced, candidate in Edmondson who has name recognition, has been around for a while. That would definitely be a big. Get for Democrats. And I still think, the national Democrats, even though CD5 is maybe demographically somewhat in play, I think it's still hard to pull that trigger for national pundits to say that an Oklahoma district is.
But this is a year you try.
Democrat.
This is the year that Democrats go all out. National Democrats go in a Republican president's midterms, first midterms. This is where you go all out in every district you think you have a chance in.
Yeah.
And every state, in a statewide race like governor. This is when you do it.
Yeah. By all accounts, I think election night in November is going to be a good night for Democrats in Oklahoma. At least, even them just winning a couple seats would be huge. When you've looked at the history. If they're able to win a statewide race like the governor, that would be huge. A congressional district, that's an uphill climb, but those would be, monumental tasks to undertake. So,
does Russell benefit from having Cornett on the ballot? Because Cornett's going to drive out more Republicans in this district, the 5th district, or am I overthinking that?
That's not something I've thought about. I don't really know. There's a lot of theories about how if obviously who Edmondson would do better against, and in a story I did a couple weeks ago, Edmondson said, "Look, I've got a game plan for both of them. I can beat them both," and there are actually a couple of polls showing him right neck and neck with both of them. You know, if the general election were today, and you know, Edmondson Stitt, Edmondson Cornett, and Edmondson's right there with both of them. But I think it would be tougher for Edmondson. I think it's tougher for the Democrats to beat Mick Cornett, and especially because of this area.
Well, I would agree with that, and I think, Justin, it's a great question to consider.
But how that affects CD5, I'm just not sure.
I mean, if Cornett is in the race, you feel like obviously, yeah, it would draw out some more voters in Oklahoma City, given that he used to be mayor here. It also may grow out, I mean, I don't know how important they would be, but, you know, maybe there are some Oklahoma City Republican endorsements that would come that if Stitt was on the ballot, they would vote for him, but probably not be as engaged. I mean, I don't know if the new Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt's going to get into the race or not. I feel like he said some things on Twitter last week that were
Trump, or are you talking? Is that
well, no, I mean like in terms of, you know, if Cornett was on the ballot, would somebody like Mayor Holt, you know, openly stump for him and endorse him, you know, versus, you know, Stitt? I mean,
that's a complicated question.
I mean, Holt would probably stay out. I would say that he probably would stay out of it. He may be tempted to support Cornett.
You know, what if Trump comes? You know, and Trump's going all over the country. And if the RNC's telling Trump, you know, it's going to be closer than you think, and they may need you, and Steve Russell may need you. You know, whoever Stitt or Cornett may need you. I mean, apparently he's relishing the idea of going to a bunch of states and stumping for, you know, he's already stumped for gubernatorial candidates in other states. So there's nothing saying that he wouldn't come here in a general election, you know. So it'd be interesting to have Holt and Trump are not going to share a stage.
And like I said, I haven't seen what he said. I believe, I thought last week, I could be wrong, I thought on Twitter last week that Holt took a little bit of a shot against some anti-Cornett rhetoric.
Yeah, he did.
Okay,
I saw that. But he hasn't endorsed him.
But he hasn't endorsed him.
That's actually a good question.
Yeah. So, and I don't know that he would endorse Cornett, but he maybe would feel tempted, especially if Edmondson was attacking him and attacking Oklahoma City.
Oh, I think it's clear that City Hall doesn't like Stitt.
Yeah,
they've made that clear on Twitter.
Yeah, so it just would be a lot of interesting factors, and just the idea of Trump stumping, Justin smiling, the idea of that story would be...
I can't imagine Russell sharing a stage with
Is that
Trump,
right?
though.
Really?
He might. I mean,
well, then Trump wouldn't come. I mean, if Russell's then I
just don't know that it would get to the point where they feel like it would benefit him. I mean...
If he needed it, it would, but Trump did not do that well in Oklahoma City.
But does Russell not like him, or...?
They have some differences. I mean, I wouldn't say he doesn't like him.
Immigration and...
immigration,
trade.
namely, and his rhetoric.
And Trump's got, I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean, Trump's got a lot of Oklahoma support. I mean, he's got some of his best favorable ratings in Oklahoma.
58% or something.
This wasn't a state that voted for him in the primary. Ted Cruz, got that nod. And someone made this point. It's interesting that, you know, Trump didn't win the primary, although he's very popular now, just being the Republican president. And now you have two Republican candidates who are trying to out-Trump the other about who likes Trump the most. I mean, that's all. We didn't even get into that, but some of the ads have been, you know, trying to say which candidate supports Trump the most. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Cornett didn't support Trump. I mean, at one point when he was mayor. And, you know, those are things that he's having to kind of walk back. But you know what? He also got a lot of support from moderates because of the stance that he took on that. So he's just maybe having to kind of pay for that today. So, all right, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State. I think we've got one more episode until the runoff. So we'll talk about this again next week. We'll see what interesting ads might pop up from either campaign. We'll be watching Wheel of Fortune to try to see, to try to get the pulse of the electorate, which that seems to be the best place to do it. So, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode. You can find each and every episode in video and on your favorite podcasting app. For the Oklahoman, I'm Ben Felder. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.